Dumu, sharing my feelings. Dissatisfied, I wandered rivers and lakes, drinking as I went. Slim-waisted girls of Chu, so light they danced in my palm. 10 years later, I awoke from my Jiangzhou dream, known only for breaking hearts in green towers. So we continue with Du Mu's heptasyllabic quatrains. This is the 5 out of 9. And this poem, Sharing My Feelings, is in many ways very similar to the two previous poems we've read, Sent to Administrative Assistant Han Chua Jiangzhou and Moored on the Qinhuai River. You could say that a common theme connecting the three poems, especially this poem and the previous one, is reminiscences of Du Mu's time in Yangzhou, which, as we explained when we talked about the previous poem, was a very important metropolis during the Tang Dynasty, a place of commerce, of riches, of merchants, of pleasure quarters. And so, the place for an Epicurean, decadent lifestyle of pleasure and music and drinking and relationships with young, beautiful women. So this poem is pretty similar, as I said, to the previous one, but there is an added element of negativity, of remembering the past, but also of this feeling of guilt at having wasted time in frivolous pursuits. So that would be the main topic of the poem, reminiscing the past, remembering the pleasures, especially the sensual pleasures that Du Mu enjoyed in Jiangzhou, but also lamenting the passage of time, which seems, 10 years, like a dream, but also not explicitly. There is this sort of self-deprecation for having devoted one's time to those pleasures. And perhaps, at least this is the interpretation of some critics, there is an element of social and political criticism implicit in it, in that the poet was not employed as he should have been in high office, and so he had no alternative, no better choice than to spend the time amusing himself. Let us remember that Du Mu, as we said, is a late Tang poet. He's writing in the middle years of the 9th century, when the dynasty is steadily and unflaggingly walking in the direction of collapse, with incompetent rulers, factional infighting at court, economic heavy taxation, droughts and floods, peasant revolts. All of this is going to end up exploding into a massive rebellion at the end of the century, the Huangqiao Rebellion, which will completely devastate the country. So there is this Epicurean fin de siècle mentality, perhaps, in the late Tang, as in other periods. And this connects very well also with classical Confucian notions of literature as a temperature, as a thermometer, as a gauge for values and behaviors and customs of one's time. It's the idea that in a prosperous time, happy and exalting literature is created. In a time of decadence, debauched literature is created. And the later perception of Du Mu as a poet of the late Tang, probably with the associations of decadence and corruption, probably make critics focus on all of those poems in which he paints these pictures of Epicurean, narcissistic pleasure seeking and decadence, instead of other poems that Du Mu also has in his repertoire about history and other issues. So the literary interpretation of the times leads to a selection, or probably influences the selection of the most representative texts of a poet from that time, which are meant to mirror the times in which he has lived. Okay, so having said this, we can take a look at the poem couplet by couplet as usual. So, first couplet: dissatisfied, I wandered rivers and lakes, drinking as I went. Slim-waisted girls of Chu, so light they danced in my palm. So the first couplet locates us strictly in the past. It doesn't indicate it yet, but as he will indicate in the second couplet, this is the memory of his days in Yangzhou 10 years ago. And what was he doing, basically? Well, he was enjoying life. But it's still very significant that the first word in the poem, at least in the translation, is dissatisfied. So he is not happy. We might speculate why, in the midst of so many pleasures, he would be dissatisfied, and the implicit answer would be probably that he is dissatisfied either because the pleasures are, just superficial things, not enough to satisfy a great man who is not a slave to his desires, but probably even more clearly, he is dissatisfied because he is not in office, he is not at court being employed. So what does a poet, a scholar official with lots of time in his hands do? Well, he does some sightseeing while he's at his post in the south. So he wanders rivers and lakes, which rivers and lakes act as a frequent metaphor for the landscape. So he wanders around, he drinks, drinking alcohol, very typical. And of course, he enjoys some more frivolous pleasures with women, slim-waisted girls of Chu, so light they danced in my palm. So girls of Chu, because we are in Yangzhou, we are in the area that was more or less equivalent to the old Warring States period state of Chu. And in the second line, in which he explains how he's enjoying these thin girls, light, that seem to dance in his palm, he is evoking literary references from the past. So slim waists, I think, is a reference to a very greedy king of the state of Chu, but it might also be a reference that I am not aware of to some beautiful lady who's described as slim-waisted, probably some empress or concubine. The dancing in my palm image is also, I think, taken from a story of a Western Han concubine wife, Chao Wei Yen, I think, or Fei Yen, who was described as being able to do this or being so light and nimble dancing that it seemed she could dance on the palm of her hand. But anyway, they just act these two images just act as fancy literary descriptions of the lovely sing-song ladies in whose company Du Mu is probably, as a Confucian would censoriously say, wasting his time. Second couplet, and the second couplet jumps us forwards in time 10 years and makes clear that what the poet was talking about in the first couplet is the past. It's a memory. It's no longer a fact. 10 years later, I awoke from my Yangzhou dream, known only for breaking hearts in green towers. So 10 years have passed. I have awakened. Maybe he was actually sleeping, and he woke up. He had been dreaming about his time on Yangzhou, but more probably this is just a metaphor of, I wake up now from this dream of Yangzhou. It seems as short as a dream, but it's been 10 years since I was in Yangzhou enjoying that sort of lifestyle. And he seems to lament, my only reputation, the only reputation I gathered there was as a heartbreaker in the Green Towers, as a heartbreaker, a seducer, a dandy in the Green Towers. Green Towers being a traditional metaphor and indirectly referring to the pleasure houses where the Simpson ladies and the prostitutes and the geisha-like ladies used to reside. So that's his legacy, and it's a pretty bleak one. And so it's a poem that really puts the focus on self-criticism. But again, as I said before, you could read it in a more general, symbolic way as the poet's complaint at not having done anything of importance, but also his partial or indirect hinting at the fact that this was so because he was not employed. I have another translation. This is the version from the book which I am reading, and Geoffrey Waters made this version. Another one I have here is from a selection of poems by Du Mu, by David Yang and Yan I. Lin, and here it's called Desire's Antidote. Translation is a bit freer, but I think it conveys pretty well the feeling. Wandering foot loose, broke, scruffy, usually drunk, in love with those slender waists, girl so light, they could stand on your open palm. 10 years in Jiangzhou went by, like one night's dream-filled sleep, as I gained a name as a playboy in every brothel and pavilion. And that's it. I think even in Tang times, Du Mu's reputation as a wastrel and as a seducer was pretty well cemented. And this is played out by the fact, among others, that there is a Tang Chuang Chi, that is a story, a fictional story called Du Mu, which basically tells of liaisons and romance. I haven't read it, but I've heard of it. So the great seducer, Du Mu, lamenting his rather reckless lifestyle.